on our agenda is to talk about the draft of the definition of sexual misconduct. And we have people from the language committee here. I don't know whether people got a chance to read the whole document, but does anybody have any suggestions or question on the draft of it? Or any clarification question, or things like, okay, now we have like a Word document about the definition, how should we apply them to the survey writing procedure, things like that.
I'm going to ask a question back. Sorry. I want to honor that I feel a little silly asking this, but maybe I'm not the only one that feels it. When I think I'm still trying to unpack the roles of this committee and the roles of the other committee around these definitions. And so I'm wondering if we could talk about that to clarify, because it feels like I keep coming to the point that maybe we're duplicating, but then I don't think we are, but which means I'm missing something. So could we maybe start there? And Martina, I see some nods. Can I invite you, Martina, since you've also been working on these things? Sorry, put you on the spot. Or does anyone else want to kind of help unpack this a little bit?
And Rowan, you might also have thoughts that you want to throw in there. And I think your thoughts are usually my favorite to pivot to. So.
I think what's important is that there is an agreed upon set of definitions that we can use for all of these things, right? And which committee they come from isn't as important. I think the survey writing committee, if you can look at the definitions mostly through a lens of, is this specific enough that I can write a question that asks about this behavior and it won't be confused with anything else? Okay, so if you look at, for example, if we're asking, has anyone done anything to you sexually without your consent? Is consent defined clearly enough there? And then that, for example, one way we might use that would be, some of the next questions ask about consent. Just to be clear, by consent, we mean blah, blah, blah. For the language subcommittee, they're coming at it more from, is this trauma-informed language? Is this clear language? Is this consistent language? Is there, right, that kind of stuff.
I have a small question. Does it mean that, so right now when we're just like drafting the very first draft of the sexual climate survey, we need to sort of we need to first read the definition of sexual misconduct and making sure that the questions that we are going to draft are completely aligned with all the definitions. And also after we finish this draft of it, before we truly distribute it, we want language committee to make sure that our language is, first of all, aligned with our agreed upon definitions of what is sexual misconduct, and then being trauma-informed enough. Is that a clear? Okay, great.
That's like brilliantly clear, as usual. Thank you, Bill. And just so you know, hi, Kelly, one other way that these definitions will be used is we are writing administrative rules to tell the schools how to interpret the law. And they need this set of definitions for that working group so that we can write the rules. And so we can say, the rules say these are the definitions. So.
I feel like that said everything that I could have said, but better. So I'm going to just check mark that.
Is there anything that anyone thinks needs clarification in those definitions?
I have two spots. Mm-hmm. So intimate partner violence as a form of domestic violence in which the persons involved are in a relationship of a romantic or sexual nature. I think a question to be asked there is, do we count former partners formerly romantically or sexually involved, especially given the ways that for some of like our college age students, like engaging in longer term sexual activity with one person without like the define the relationship talk is like a real thing. And so like how exactly are we defining that? What counts as former, what counts as current? And I'll let other people jump in there.
So in the next definition in domestic violence, it does say this relationship may be past or current, but it would certainly make sense to put that in the definition of intimate partner violence too, if people feel like that's specific enough. And maybe I'll go ahead and share my screen so we can all take a look at that right now and see if that looks like it would work. Okay, there we go.
Quick question. Is there anything about the law that would tell us that while past, I mean, it can past precede arrival at a particular school or institution? Or, I mean, I'm wondering, isn't it circumscribed at least partially or intentionally about the institution at which the student is at?
This law is not circumscribed in that way. I understand that Title IX might be, and there might be other laws and regulations, but there's nothing. One of the things that the survey writing group is going to have to decide is what period of time you're asking about. But for a definition of intimate partner violence or domestic violence, and stalking, I don't know if it's in stalking or not. Stalking is in domestic violence, but the relationship may be past or current.
Thank you.
Yeah. And just a reminder, we don't have to limit our discussion to things that are legal definitions either. We can consider those to be the floor. Oh, Dana, I see. Hi, you. Okay. Oh, you're muted. Okay, try again. Oh, no. Okay. Okay. Oh, wait, say something. Turn your mic back on and say, okay, I think I just heard. Yes.
Hello.
We can hear
Okay,
you.
maybe I have to move closer. What I was saying was, even though that's the definition, when we write up the questions, we could give like within this past 2 years or since you've been here or whatever, but we could ask about their past experience as well as a separate section.
We could do that if it was felt that wouldn't make the survey too long and it wouldn't, and it would be information that would be relevant. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, well, that's why I don't know about their past. That's why I would think we would want their current time frame to see what's going on within the past school year. Have you experienced this, or since you've been at this school, have you experienced this? And then if we decide, or maybe that can be an optional if the school wants to ask about their past history or something like that. Or we could just say, have you experienced this, and ask the location. Was it on campus? Was it faculty? Was it a partner or something like that? We could do it separately that way.
So one of the reasons that we have the relationship could be past or current in intimate partner violence and domestic violence is that the relationship may have ended a couple of years ago, and that person is still harassing me. That person still is checking up on me,
Wow.
Making threats to me or something like that. So that's why that's in there, because intimate partner violence can be with someone you're currently involved with, but it can also be somebody that you were formerly involved with or that you're trying to leave.
So that could be probably when you identify the person, so a past partner or something like that. But within this past year, this is what's happened to me. So I guess that's what you're saying.
Yeah, a separate discussion is going to be, okay, so what time frame do we want to ask about? Like what window do we want to look at? And we can talk then if we want to talk about within the last year or since you started at school or however we want to define that window. But yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure. But for the definitions, and that was a really good point. So if I added that the relationship could be past or current to intimate partner violence, was there anything else that folks had questions about, or wanted to do some wordsmithing on?
I
do have
guess
one. Oh, go ahead, Belle.
Thank you. I guess one little question is that I know because the statutes clearly mention that intimate partner violence and domestic violence are like sort of two different things. But I'm still I feel a little bit confused because I feel like both terms are kind of talking about the same thing, except domestic violence is talking about, oh, this person could also be a family member of yours, but intimate partner is more like, oh, if you guys are in a dating relationship or a casual sexual relationship, maybe that also counts. I'm thinking about like whether like it would be easier for people just say like just integrate these two things together, or we have a clearer definitions of each other so that we can like distinguish these two terms like in a better way that would cause less confusion, because for me it seems like they overlap with each other a lot.
They do, and the law specifically mentions those two things. So that's why intimate partner violence is a form of domestic violence. Domestic violence could be intimate partner violence, and it could also be a family member. Sorry, Martina. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that was really well said. And I would really argue that it's important to have both terms for the reasons that Rowan just said. And also because the history of the concept of domestic violence has so been about familial violence or violence within the home, that many people who have experienced sexual violence or relational violence within intimate partner relationships, but who never lived together, like don't consider themselves. And there's been updates to law that has had to happen in order to correct for that, like in our stalking laws, etc. So I think it's important to have both terms, even though they do overlap in a big way, and even though they sound really similar, because there are going to be some people who see domestic and just count themselves out of that no matter what. And so having the both and is, I think, a significant way to correct for that.
Well, thank you for clarification. I think that's very helpful.
Something along the same lines that I've been thinking a lot about, and this is something we can absolutely talk about more later when we think about fine-tuning things. And if it's helpful right now, I read an article recently that was really talking about what college students, the language that college students are using. And it was comparing domestic violence, relationship abuse, and dating violence. And basically the research findings was that dating violence was most relevant for most students, were more likely to identify what dating violence meant or dating abuse versus relationship abuse or domestic violence. So I say that in just wondering if it's helpful to include in one of these definitions. Another term for this can be dating violence, just to help as we kind of try to help the folks we're talking about identify what these things are in language, because it can be really difficult. And I agree. I think depending on the type of relationship you have as a college student, or any, regardless of where you're at in your life, domestic violence isn't a meaningful term to a lot of people. And I also know why we have to have it in here. So.
I just wanted to second that, because that was something that I was thinking is, are we trying to encompass dating violence under intimate partner violence? And if so, I think it's important to be explicit about that, because, you know, I like you were saying, like I think folks associate intimate partner violence with somebody that they're in a long-term relationship with or things like that. And I think that that'll be helpful for us and for, you know, the higher education institutions that are disseminating this. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there too.
Okay. Does that change, that edit that I just added, does that help? Other terms for this might include dating violence or relationship abuse. Okay.
Yeah. Also, it's staying with me, and I know it depends on the state, so I might be conflating Washington state, but under the definition of domestic violence, do we need to include roommates? Because people cohabiting in the same house. And I recognize that really complicates things.
If you think so remember, this is the base, right? And you can ask other questions if you think it's relevant. So yeah, roommate abuse it's different, right? Because it could be bullying, it could be, yeah. Thinking about,
we have to, so thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too, but I'm not, yeah. So I don't know how people feel about it.
Well, your question about the laws is also really relevant there, because there's been like in different types of in different ways of in different criminal codes, it's been defined differently, like within stalking versus for the purposes of a sexual assault protective order versus for the purposes of a divorce. Like those things can be defined really differently, and it is really unclear. I would definitely argue, and that was actually one of the points that I was going to bring up, and so I'm so glad I'm not the only one, that having roommates either specifically included within domestic violence or called out in their own spot is really important. Over the last 3 years in particular, we've seen at our agency a pretty significant uptick in people who are experiencing violence from roommates and or landlords. And because of the particular ways that they are vulnerable within those spaces, and because of the financial coercion element, I think it's a really critical piece to name. And I don't know exactly how to do that, because it is going, people don't perceive it as domestic violence often, even if they're like, well, we live in the same domicile. But it is like a really particular and unique thing that, particularly in this population of folks who are often living with roommates collectively, I do think is important to call out in some way.
It doesn't exactly fall under the umbrella of sexual misconduct. I just want to clarify that. One way that you could handle that if you wanted was in, and I'm sorry, I don't have the list in front of me, but one of those questions, A, B, C, or D, asks about who it was that harmed you. And you could have in your list of possible responses, roommate, landlord, dorm room, dorm mate, something like that, if you wanted to do that. I don't think it's as critical that, and then what is a relationship, right? Like, yeah, we don't want to define that. We want the people to say, yeah, this was what happened. So again, getting to those behaviorally specific questions, and then maybe breaking down in who did it to you. Yeah.
I was thinking something similar, Rowan, that the definition, as long as it's sufficiently broad and inclusive, as we've been discussing, then maybe a single question, rather than trying to put all the different pieces into one question, a single question that then asks, who was it, or what was the context? Obviously with the need to have a category that lets people fill in, because we can't, I mean, that sort of a question should only have 4 or 5 really broad possible answers plus one other, so that people can tell you if you missed one, because if they have to go through the long list, the chances that we'll get, it makes it harder for people to decide which category their experience it falls into. So anyway,
yeah,
agreeing with that, I think that's the way to go, that adding a specific question is the way to go there.
Yeah, and I don't think you need to have separate sections for intimate partner violence or for, for domestic violence or intimate partner violence. I don't think you need separate sections for that. I think it all could be one question. It's just that the law says we have to ask about this. This is how we're asking about that. Yeah. When we were looking at some of the sample surveys that we had, like the kinds of the behaviors they were describing were so specific, and I feel like avoiding that level of specificity is really kind of key too. Okay, all right. Is there anything else that folks would like to see changed or included? And I'm going to go back to this. So we have sexual misconduct. That's what the statute gives us. And then it tells us that sexual harassment has the meaning given in this, or we're saying that it has the meaning given in that law, because that's the broad sexual harassment definition that all of the colleges and universities were required to adopt by Oregon law. And I think it's a pretty good one, really. And then we have sexual violence. And then that's why it says when the person is unable to give consent or without the person's consent. So that's why we define what consent means. Then we have intimate partner violence and domestic violence. Under sexual exploitation, and again, those of you who have worked with survivors directly as advocates, if you could, I was trying to capture some of the things that I know have happened on campuses. So that idea of non-consensual image sharing, exhibitionism, of voyeurism. Are there other kinds of sexual exploitation that you can think of that you have seen happening with survivors, that things that obviously have a sexual kind of component to them, but aren't necessarily called out in any of the others?
The only thing that I might throw in, and I don't know exactly where to do this, whether it's more appropriate in stalking or in sexual exploitation. And I'll say right up front that like we don't have super great shared language about this yet, sort of globally. But what is sometimes now being called like crowdsourced harassment. So that would include like, for lack of a better way of talking about this, like sicking an online mob on someone. Is a phenomenon that we're seeing within stalking in much more than we had in the past. And there's like all this stuff coming out about like AI deepfake, blah, blah, blah. And honestly, we're not seeing that in the same way that we're seeing people who are like that, like stalking may involve the use of third parties. The third party, maybe it's a mutual friend, but more often these days, it's that person's 10,000 Twitter followers or whatever who are now being directed to harass this person and give them rape threats and whatever. So I don't know exactly how to talk about that. And as a field, we're still trying to figure that out. But the best language that I've heard yet is crowdsourced harassment, just to complicate things.
Okay. We have, yeah, and flying monkeys is actually my favorite way of talking about that. I think that's such a great term. In stalking, we have stalking may involve the use of third parties to accomplish the behaviors. But that could also fall under harassment, sexual harassment, right? And then one other thing I just want to point out, we have not talked about gender-based harassment. And we could come up with it's not required, it's not in the the statute doesn't say sexual misconduct includes this. Oh no, there we go. Harassment or violence based on sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. Or other gender-based harassment or violence. So we don't have a definition for what gender-based harassment or violence means.
Is there any plan for the language committee to add a definition for gender-based violence?
We can do that right now.
While you're writing that out, can I follow up on Martina's point and just, I'm curious in thinking about, do we need to think about crowd stalking, crowdsourced harassment? I find myself asking myself, if I were to read any of these other if I had experienced that and I were to read any of these other definitions, would I feel any justification not including myself because of that? And I mean, I don't know, I'm actually asking, I don't know the answer. I'm guessing that would be plenty traumatic, and I would probably lump it together with these, but I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to it. I'm just thinking out loud as to, but it also prompted me to think about like sort of an in-between kind of level that we see a lot on campuses with student cancellations, where a group of friends will then sort of cancel somebody because of something that they've done or something they've said, or I mean, it'd be a lower level, lower intensity version of the 100,000 Twitter people all attacking you at once. But I don't know. I mean, to me, the crucial thing would be, hey, do we lose anything by adding more language? Is it making it more complicated? If we don't lose anything, it's fine. If we're afraid of losing something by adding more language, is there any scenario in which we could realistically envision that people would omit that, or would they likely include it just from their own thought process? That, again, thinking out loud about how language works.
One thing I would one thing I'm thinking about, Kelly, based on what you just shared, is because some of the things we're adding here, right? There's different terms we're trying to add to make sure people can see themselves in it. And I think about how often people experience this type of violence, and they don't use the words us in the field are using. So I do think less or more is more in these circumstances. especially when we are using language that students are using when they're talking about it. I think that can be so meaningful. And I'm wondering, and I know this is also farther down the line, but we can just doing that, this includes in a bulleted list of common terms. Because I do think a lot of students may see that they're getting harassed by a whole bunch of people on social media because of their ex, but they aren't calling that domestic violence and they're not calling it sexual misconduct, right? So that's why I love the idea of pulling it out. And we have to be careful that doesn't get too long.
Yeah, no, that's a compelling case. And then the more supporting that approach is, the more of those, even if you get up to 5 or 6 of them, the more of them you include, the more likely people are going to include their own version of it if they see plenty of examples of the unusual being included. So that's a compelling case. I would agree.
Well, and I'll say that when we've seen this, often we have seen people who, I think, again, wouldn't necessarily describe what they are experiencing as sexual harassment, but as harassment. And the fact that there is an underlying threat of sexual violence is, like, for example, means that they're eligible for our services. And so there's like a didactic purpose in this, in helping folks potentially understand and define something that has happened to them in a different way. Because if someone just comes and says like, an online mob was mean to me, that doesn't necessarily fall under the purview. But what we know from experience is that most of the time, especially if a person is a woman or a sexual gender minority in any way, that like there's an undertone of sexual violence, there's an underlying threat implicit within that. And that we just have to name that for them. And then they're like, oh yeah, I guess it is sexual harassment. And then we're like, great, let's get you a lawyer. And that can kind of change their access. So I think that there's definitely some intention, like there's a reason to include that in one of those like sort of bulleted lists without necessarily having to make that like a focal point of anything.
I think those are great points. Just on the document that we're looking at, I did add, I think that these two things could be the same definition, but you can tell me if you think that they aren't. Harassment or violence based on sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, and gender-based harassment or violence means. And then, and then how do you want to define this? Because we want to definitely catch the kind of transphobia, right? And the violence that trans folk experience. We want to catch the kind of violence. I'm thinking about 2 women I know who were egged walking down the street because they were holding hands, that kind of stuff, right? So how do we define that in a way that people might see themselves there?
And Lindsay just put something at a definition in the chat too.
Oh, great. I didn't see that. Lindsay, I really like that. Okay.
I think that unless I read it too quickly, the main things we might want to add is talking about sexual orientation as well. So we might need to add something there.
I'm also thinking about with regard to the part that talk about what it means to be a man or woman, boy or girl. Maybe we can just use define expectation of, like define stereotype of a certain gender. Maybe that would be more inclusive.
I think, Bill, the reason that they called out man or woman, boy or girl is because I agree with you. I think it could be more inclusive, but that people get harassed because they're not fitting that very narrow definition.
I'm wondering how we reword it though, so that then we can capture maybe that a little bit better. So that
maybe the binary gender stereotype, things like that.
I'd be curious why. I mean, to Rowan's point, those man, woman, boy, girl, those are the basis for the harassment driven by. I mean, why not keep the definition that people are insisting is being violated when they then target somebody for harassment?
I changed it to male, female, binary gender stereotypes because I agree with you, Kelly, but I think pointing out that it's binary gender stereotypes is really helpful. Because if someone does identify, how do I say this? If I identify as woman and I do things that are outside of that if I do anything I do as a woman is something that women do. But if I'm doing something that is gender stereotyped, that it's not something that I do. So I don't know. I can't. I love that I'm having a really hard time thinking of something that I can't do because I'm a woman. But that I guess taking care of children, right? Like that, still like holding an infant. If you're a guy and you've ever held an infant and in a public place, like the kind of harassment that you get can be kind of off the charts because you're not doing that. Or binary expectations, a man who carries a bag that people might consider a purse.
I think it also, tries to capture like non-binary folks and like existing outside of that binary. And I know at OSU we've seen a lot of harassment for that as well. So just not even existing in the binary as opposed to like existing outside of like a traditional masculine or feminine stereotype. I don't know if that makes sense, but trying to capture like all of those different experiences. So I agree, Rowan.
Okay.
I think this is useful also because like there's a lot of policing of gender even amongst folks who are gender expansive, right? That like the way to be like the right kind of or a good kind of a trans person is to have certain types of surgeries, et cetera. That is its own form of gendered expectations and performance expectations. Even if that person is being accepted as trans, they're not like doing trans right or whatever. And I think talking about the male, female, binary gender stereotypes kind of gives us that broad umbrella under which I think people could see themselves sort of in a lot of different ways.
Am I muted? No. I don't know how important it is. If this, as a definition, I think this is okay, but I think this is, even with or without that change, this is asking people to think harder than they need to about the meaning of the sentence. And here, it's the adherence is the word that I'm hanging up on here. Is any form of gender-based violence is any form of violence against an individual based on biological sex, gender identity, or expression, or perceived adherence to socially defined expectations. In my brain, I'm wanting that to be perceived deviation from socially. If the violence is based on, and I don't know, I'm just wondering if we could simplify this somehow, that the violence comes from perception that you have deviated from the socially defined expectations. Is this making sense to others, or I think it could go either way, and that's the problem. I think everybody understands what it's trying to say, but it's worded in such a complicated way that it may not be easy for people to understand. And as I've said several times in these conversations, like anything that causes people to work harder to perceive what they're reading and how they're answering is going to risk that they'll opt out of the survey at some point.
Just a reminder, these definitions will not necessarily appear in the survey, like maybe consent might, but all of these definitions don't need to appear there. We can just ask questions about behaviors that would meet that. So have you ever felt discriminated against or felt afraid in a public space because someone called you names or because of your gender identity or something, right? Like we can ask a question without having to put that definition in there. The definitions will go in the implementation guide so that we can help the schools understand these questions, ask about these behaviors that we're defining in this way.
Yeah, We don't need to keep going on this. I guess I'm just curious if anybody else, I feel like by swapping adherence to with perceived deviation, like how I read the sentence doesn't actually change, even though those words actually mean opposites, the sentence still reads the same to me, which is fine. But that hence the origin of my concern in the first place, which is, anyway, it looked good. I would say I like the perceived deviation better. I'm just fascinated by the fact that it doesn't seem to actually change how I read the sentence, even though we've flipped the meaning of two words 150, 180%, 180 degrees, sorry.
Yeah.
I'll stop.
I'm glad you brought that up because I was having trouble with adherence too, and I wasn't quite sure where. But yeah, there was something about it that wasn't sounding correct. Okay. How do we want to? So that could be harassment or violence based on gender. What do we want to do for sexual orientation? How do we want to define harassment or violence based on sexual orientation? Or is that self-explanatory enough?
Well, I'll say that the legal argument has been made before that discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation is fundamentally discrimination on the basis of perceived gender roles. So perhaps it falls under there, right? Because the perceived gender role is that women and men should be in heterosexual relationships, and deviation from that is therefore gender-based. That's just the legal argument that has been made. I don't know if I feel great about it one way or another, but
it's kind of limited because I'm thinking about polycules, and I'm also thinking about non-binary folks who are in relationships. So yeah. I think I think we could specify it, and then we can also ask just ask a question. Have you ever felt that you were, have you ever felt afraid or felt that you were being discriminated against because of your sexual orientation? Right. Yeah.
One way, if we don't keep them separate, and I'm fine either way, could we just say gender-based violence includes sexual orientation violence and is any form of violence against, and then it's just a qualifier at the beginning that sort of makes clear that they're just a thought. I could go either way on that one.
It could be something like by harassment or violence based on sexual orientation, what we mean is any kind of discrimination or harassment because of the people that one is or is not in a relationship, a romantic or sexual relationship with. Something like that, maybe.
I was going to add maybe real or perceived in there because people are perceived all the time and still experience violence.
Okay. I'm having trouble, guys. My brain just shut down. Help.
I'm going to type an idea in the chat.
Okay.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello? Oh, you can hear me. Gender-based violence is rooted in GBV is rooted in gender-related power differences. You guys already talked about this. Is that what we want to say?
Can you say more, Adea?
Just thinking, I would say can be rooted instead of is, or is often or something, because I can think of males that could be harassed by females based on maybe it's just something, maybe the person rejected them and they remembered. Not that you have that I don't think that could be the situation, but it could be. Yeah, so.
Okay, Caroline.
Martina added a great one too. I took some of your, Martina, and added to mine.
Okay.
And I don't know, I think that what I added, I definitely think needs edits. I appreciate all the ideas that are coming out.
Yeah, I think that the trickiest piece here is like, how do we include language that includes people who are asexual, right? Like it's easy to say like, oh, who they're romantically or sexually attracted to, but like also people experience violence as a result of not experiencing sexual or romantic attraction, and that is its own complexity.
Right.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, that's.
And I'm going to add. Oh.
Well,
Yeah.
couldn't we just say who they are or are not romantically or sexually attracted to?
Mhm.
I was thinking
That
the
would
same
encompass
thing.
that.
I just wasn't sure if that was convoluted, but Tiffany, I was thinking the same thing.
Okay, help me with grammar here. Who they are or are not attracted to romantically or sexually. Is that better grammar?
I personally don't like the rule that says that you can't end a sentence with a preposition, but to whom you may be attracted to or involved. I mean, there's no official rule for this. We all end sentences with prepositions. I don't think we should worry about it.
Okay. All right.
Could we just like focus maybe on the definitions and then run it through Grammarly later?
I don't trust Grammarly either.
Never mind.
No, I think including not being attracted to others. Okay, Caroline, I saw that. Attracted to or involved with. Or in a okay. Or in a relationship with. And then
I think
Thank
you
you.
can't remove that little bit from the sentence above, the or who they are or not, since you added that last little bit to the sentence. I think that will help.
Others, and then we need to have by gender, including the genders of the person, right? Because it's not the who, it's the gender. Is that correct? Based on the real, or the genders of the people. And that makes then that makes the little tail, the little clause at the end worse.
I'm wondering if we just need to break it into two sentences, if that would help.
Okay.
maybe, and this might not bring it up the correct way, but we mean violence or harassment that is perpetrated against someone based on their real or perceived sexual orientation or, oh, actually, I almost want to put a period there, but then we have to, it just feels, I think it feels difficult to understand because it's just so long.
Martina, I think that's good, but it's not necessarily identifying as much as being perceived as, right? Yeah, it could be identifying, but it could also, like, I could like harass you because I know that you're gay and I don't like you, or I could harass you because I think you might be gay and I don't like you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the identifying or being perceived as is the critical piece. I'm just wondering if instead of trying to like torture the definition, if we can just again use that like list of examples and people will fill in the blanks for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, I'm a terrible typist. The problem with that, honestly, is that we're going to get people who are going to do whatabouts. You know, what about someone who's being harassed because they're not straight?
If I'm wondering if we can put a period after perceived orientation and then say, and then almost explain, because what we're doing is we're trying to expand on sexual orientation, right? Or the gender of the people they are romantically or sexually attracted to or in a relationship with. For me, that's the piece that I'm struggling with. And I'm wondering if we say, this includes the gender of the people they are romantically with or sexually attracted to. I'm wondering if there's just a way to add some commas in there.
Okay, so this may include violence or harassment against someone based on their real or perceived sexual orientation, and then
like this includes
okay.
The gender of the people they are romantically. I think there's a lot of ors for me, and I'm trying to think of another way to write it without so many ors.
Can we do a comma after sexual orientation, and then it would be the gender of the people they are romantically or sexually attracted to, comma, or in a relation, and then or in a relationship? Because yeah, I'm thinking the same thing, just making it kind of more like a list.
Okay, what would can you so reading what's on the screen, can you tell me what to do with that? I'm trying to catch what you said, but I'm not sure I got it all.
So after a relationship with, we can do comma at the end right there, and then and. Do we want to do that? And not being attracted to others? So that it's like all of these things. Does that make sense?
Maybe or.
can we take romantically or sexually out altogether so as to remove one of the ors in that particular clause? Does or do we understand it any differently if we just say attracted to or in a relationship with versus romantically or sexually attracted to or in a relationship?
Mm-hmm.
There's like a lot of discourse about that in some spaces, right? Because there can be differences between romantic and sexual orientation for folks. I don't know if we necessarily need to include it, but if we are trying to be like as inclusive as possible, you might want to.
My only rationale was to get the extra or out. So other than that, I have no objection.
I agree entirely. Like my English professor heart is dying at the convolutedness of these sentences. And also like, there's always the, Rowan, what did you call them? The like, what about people or the
Yeah,
but
what
actually?
aboutists. Yeah.
Yeah.
And honestly, I feel, having survived the last 20 odd years of this stuff, I really feel like the fewer targets you give the whatabouters, the better, because they're looking for them. And especially in a public thing. Okay, I put semicolons in. Does that help? It's better than commas.
It helps me, but I'm not sure I'm representative of I use them exactly that way. Anytime my writing is more complicated, I throw semicolons in, hoping people will pause and read each clause a little more carefully. But I'm not sure that I don't know if that generalizes or not.
It's almost 3 o'clock. I feel like we've done a lot of work. Why don't I'm going to go ahead and upload this back to Basecamp. And if you can review it and kind of think about it and wordsmith it, remember, download a copy of it, turn track changes on, play around with it, and then upload your copy again. Okay. All right. It's fun. Thank you, Martina. Right. Okay. And I'm going to stop sharing. Hang on. There we go. Okay. Oof. Do we have another meeting scheduled? I feel like we're just like, it feels like we need, I wonder if maybe our next meeting could be 90 minutes instead of an hour. So I hate to crunch into your time more.
So 2 weeks from now is the week before Thanksgiving. So that's going to work for most people probably.
I think longer would be better because we're inching along pretty slowly. And I know that we do have a timeline. So if people can give it, I think that would be helpful to keep us moving.
Fine with me.
Yeah, I'm good with it.
All right, chairs, should we? You're muted.
Oh, so Martina has a good question in the chat. Do you want the language committee to attend the next meeting also?
What do y'all think? I think that I feel like Martina, it was so helpful to have you here as another perspective to talk to the language. So I'll definitely note that. We are going to be, I think, pretty sure at the next meeting, we are going to be diving into the questions though. So maybe this will be, unless anyone disagrees, as an opportunity to see any feedback you might all have. If it's not too early for some initial thoughts around or feedback on the definitions. I know there's going to be more eyes on it. What do y'all think? Think it's okay if Martina does not attend the next meeting?
Yeah, I was thinking maybe the final product, once we've gotten a definition down, is the final product that we would need her to look over or the committee to look over.
Perfect. Okay, it is 3:01. Unless anyone says otherwise, I think we should go ahead and adjourn this meeting.
Aye.
Perfect. Thank you all so much.